The final moments of a man's life are a sacred, terrifying space. For Benjamin Ritchie, inmate number 992823, those moments were measured not by the ticking of a clock on the wall, but by the slow, silent push of a plunger. On May 20th, 2025, inside the sterile white walls of Indiana State Prison, a 25-year-long story of violence, justice, and legal battles reached its predetermined end. At 45 years old, Ritchie was executed for a crime he committed as a boy of 20, the murder of police officer Bill Toney. It was an act of shocking brutality. A frantic chase, a cornered fugitive, 4 gunshots that stole a husband, a son, and a protector from the world. On the surface, the story seems tragically simple, a cop killer meeting the ultimate justice. But what if the story didn't begin on that frantic night in September 2000? What if the fatal flaw, the seed of this tragedy, was planted before Benjamin Ritchie ever took his first breath? For decades, his lawyers argued that the man who pulled the trigger was not a cold-blooded monster, but a victim himself, a man with a brain irreparably damaged by alcohol in his mother's womb. This case forces us to confront an unsettling question. Where does responsibility begin when the capacity for judgment is compromised from birth? This is not just the story of a crime. It is the story of a collision between a broken life and an unyielding system, leaving behind a legacy that challenges the very definition of justice. Welcome to Final Regrets. We explore the untold stories and final confessions from death row. If you believe in the power of true stories to make us think deeper, consider subscribing to our channel. To understand the man executed on that May morning, we must look beyond the killer he became. We have to rewind past the gunshots, past the prison bars, and look to the child he was, or rather the child he never truly had a chance to be. Benjamin Ritchie's story began with a poison, one administered before he was born. It was not a substance he chose, but one that would define every moment of his existence. His defense in court would later give it a name, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or FASD, a clinical, sterile term for a devastating reality. While in the womb, his developing brain was steeped in alcohol, a silent thief that stole parts of his potential before they could ever form. He was born into a world that operated on a set of rules he could never quite grasp. Imagine navigating life with a faulty compass, where the connection between action and consequence is a constant, frustrating fog. For young Benjamin, this wasn't a theory, it was his daily struggle. Poor impulse control wasn't a simple behavioral flaw, it was a neurological default. The inability to foresee the results of his actions wasn't intentional recklessness, it was a cognitive blind spot. School was a battlefield of confusion, and friendships were fleeting, often ending in misunderstandings he couldn't comprehend. He drifted, as many with his invisible disability do, towards the only people who didn't seem to judge or demand what he couldn't give, others living on the fringes. Petty crime became a clumsy attempt at belonging, a way to navigate a world that felt alien. Each poor decision was a symptom of a deeper affliction. The choice to steal a truck on September 29, 2000, alongside 2 accomplices, was not the beginning of his downfall. It was merely the final, catastrophic misstep on a path he was set upon from conception. For a 20-year-old whose brain was hardwired for the present moment, that single bad choice was about to collide with a man who represented everything he could never be: order, duty, and consequence. The night air of Beech Grove, Indiana was split by the wail of sirens. For Benjamin Ritchie and his accomplices, the thrill of a stolen truck had evaporated, replaced by the hot panic of pursuit. A blur of red and blue lights filled the rearview mirror, closing in. This was the collision. The moment where a lifetime of poor impulses met the unyielding force of the law. Ritchie made a decision that only a mind fixated on the immediate present could make. He bailed. A desperate, impulsive gamble, abandoning the vehicle and plunging into the darkness on foot. In one of the pursuing patrol cars was Officer Bill Toney. At 31, he was a man defined by duty. He didn't hesitate. His training took over, his commitment drove him forward. He was out of his car in a flash, his feet pounding the pavement in pursuit of the fleeing suspect. The chase was a frantic ballet of shadows and adrenaline. Alleyways, fences, the sharp sound of ragged breaths cutting through the cold night air. For a few heart-stopping moments, they were two figures locked in a primal contest of hunter and hunted. Then it happened. In a narrow, poorly lit space, the chase came to an abrupt halt. Ritchie, cornered and with nowhere left to run, turned. There was a flash of metal in his hand. A decision was made in a microsecond, with consequences that would span a quarter of a century. It wasn't a prolonged struggle. It wasn't a negotiation. It was 4 sharp, deafening cracks that tore through the quiet Indiana night. 4 shots. Officer Bill Toney fell. In an instant, his world of order, duty, and service was extinguished. He was the first, and to this day the only police officer in the history of the Beech Grove Police Department to be killed in the line of duty. A sacred line had been crossed. This act didn't just take a life, it shattered a community's sense of safety and murdered a symbol of its protection. The manhunt for Ritchie was intense and brief. He was captured the next day. The courtroom became the new stage for this tragedy. For the prosecution, the case was straightforward and brutal. A heroic police officer murdered in cold blood by a remorseless criminal. A cop killer. It was a narrative that demanded the ultimate punishment. But Ritchie's defense attorneys tried to tell a different, far more complicated story. They argued that the jury needed to look not at the man in the defendant's chair, but at the damaged brain inside his skull. They presented evidence of his fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, painting a picture of a man whose ability to reason, to foresee consequences, was catastrophically impaired. They argued that the act, while horrific, was not a product of malice, but of a disability. A tragic, predictable outcome of a neurological condition he never chose. The jury was faced with a monumental task. Was this an act of pure evil, or the tragic result of a damaged life? Could justice be served by executing a man who may not have possessed the mental capacity to be truly culpable? In 2002, they delivered their verdict, guilty, and their recommendation, death. On October 15, 2002, the judge's gavel fell, and Benjamin Ritchie was formally sentenced to die. The legal battle was over, but the war for his life had just begun. The bang of the gavel faded, but its echo would last for over 2 decades. For Benjamin Ritchie, the world shrank to the dimensions of a cell on death row. Life was no longer measured in milestones, but in the monotonous rhythm of institutional survival. Sunrise and sunset viewed through a sliver of reinforced glass. The slow, agonizing passage of 23 years, each day a carbon copy of the one before, all of it lived under the shadow of a state-sanctioned death. Throughout this long winter, the legal battle raged on. Year after year, his lawyers fought, filing appeal after appeal, their arguments echoing through the halls of the Indiana Supreme Court and up to the highest federal courts in the land. They presented the same haunting argument at every turn. The jury that condemned him to death never truly understood the man they were sentencing. They presented MRI scans, expert testimony, and heartbreaking accounts of a life defined by the invisible cage of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. This, they pleaded, was not an excuse but an explanation, a mitigating factor of profound significance. But to the courts, the act was all that mattered. The image of a fallen officer was too powerful, the crime too severe. Each appeal was systematically denied. A final plea for clemency to the governor of Indiana, a request for mercy, was also met with silence. The system, once set in motion, was proving to be an unstoppable force. Then in April of 2025, the abstract threat became a fixed point in time. The Indiana Supreme Court set the date. Suddenly, the shadow had a shape. Death was no longer a vague possibility, it was an appointment. The final 24 hours of a condemned man's life are a ritual of profound surreality. Even in the face of annihilation, the mundane machinery of the state continues. Ritchie's final legal efforts were not to prove his innocence, but for a small measure of comfort, the right to have his spiritual advisor physically present with him in the chamber. That too was debated, fought over, a final bureaucratic hurdle at the end of his life. He was asked to choose a final meal. His request was strangely ordinary, a poignant grasp for a normalcy he had long been denied. A tour of Italy from an Olive Garden. A taste of a free world he hadn't known since he was a young man. As the appointed hour approached, he was led into the execution chamber. A sterile, quiet room watched by witnesses through a pane of glass. This was it. The final scene. When asked if he had any last words, his voice was clear. He didn't speak of the crime. He didn't claim innocence. His final thoughts were turned outward. "I love my family, my friends, and all the support I've received," he said. "I hope they all find peace." With those words spoken into the silence, the chemicals began to flow. The long echo of the gavel finally faded, and Benjamin Ritchie's story, which began with a poison in the womb, ended with one in his veins. The death of Benjamin Ritchie did not bring closure. An execution is an endpoint, not an answer. It closed a file, but it opened a Pandora's box of unsettling questions that linger long after the chamber fell silent. The legacy of this case is not found in the fact of the execution itself, but in the profound moral and legal ambiguity it represents. It stands as a stark monument to the collision between our desire for absolute justice and the messy, complicated reality of the human mind. For the community of Beech Grove, the scar remains. Officer Bill Toney is immortalized as a hero who made the ultimate sacrifice, and his name is a permanent reminder of the risks law enforcement face. But Ritchie's execution also forced the state of Indiana to confront its own relationship with the death penalty, carrying out only its second execution in over 15 years. It was a societal act that raised more questions than it answered about what kind of justice we seek. And then there are his final words. "I love my family, my friends, and all the support I've received. I hope they all find peace." There is a haunting simplicity to them. There is no grand confession, no desperate claim of innocence, no direct apology to the Toney family. In his final moments, his focus narrowed to the circle of people who stood by him. Was this a reflection of a mind unable to grasp the wider impact of his actions? Or was it the quiet, final sentiment of a man who felt his own supporters were the only ones who ever saw him as more than a monster? The words hanging in the air, a final enigmatic puzzle piece. But the true enduring legacy of Benjamin Ritchie is the spotlight his case shines on the ghosts within our justice system. The countless individuals navigating courts, prisons, and even death row with unseen developmental disabilities. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is not an excuse for murder, but it is an explanation that complicates everything. Our legal system is built on the bedrock of concepts like intent, premeditation, and moral culpability. It demands a defendant who is a rational actor, capable of weighing consequences. What happens when that bedrock cracks? What is justice for a man who pulled a trigger, but whose ability to understand why he shouldn't was compromised before he was even born? The law seeks black and white, but Ritchie's case is a universe of intractable gray. He is a tragic figure in the truest sense of the word. A man whose inherent flaw, a flaw he did not choose, led him directly to a devastating end. His story forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. In our quest to punish a crime, did we fail to see the broken person behind it? We executed the killer, but we may have also executed the evidence of our own system's limitations. So we are left here in the quiet aftermath. Benjamin Ritchie is gone. Officer Bill Toney is gone. 2 lives, 2 families, forever shattered by a single, catastrophic moment born from a lifetime of disadvantage. This channel doesn't exist to give you easy answers. My purpose is not to tell you that Benjamin Ritchie's execution was right or wrong. It is to hold up this story in all its painful complexity and acknowledge the weight of what it contains. The legal system declared justice was served. A man who killed a police officer paid the ultimate price. For many, that is a necessary and righteous equation. The scales are balanced. But do they truly balance? Can the execution of a man with a documented, profound brain impairment truly be called justice? Or is it simply the final tragic outcome of a societal failure that began decades earlier? Does the concept of an eye for an eye apply when one of the eyes was blind from the start? This is the question that should haunt us. We, as a society, are the ones who build and uphold the justice system. We are the ones who grant it the power of life and death. And therefore, cases like this one belong to all of us. They are our shared moral burden. The story of Benjamin Ritchie is over, but the conversation it demands is not. In the comments below, I want to hear your thoughts. But I ask you to do so with the same thoughtfulness this story requires. Let's move beyond simple declarations of "he deserved it" or "it's inhumane." Let's talk about the nuances. Where does personal responsibility end and societal responsibility begin? Should developmental disabilities like FASD change how we apply the death penalty, or even how we define guilt? What does true justice look like when a crime is committed by a mind that was broken long before the law was? If this story has made you think, if it has challenged you, then please share it. Not for the sake of views, but for the sake of the conversation. Because it's only by wrestling with these difficult stories that we can ever hope to understand the true meaning of justice. Thank you for watching.